It's also the name dropping. It's the elite kind of nature of some of the content, the way that they present themselves or their experience, constantly talking about the Silicon Valley companies, basically saying we are smarter than everybody else. Yeah. We know how to figure everything out. And so that's why you're reading this book, is because you're not going to work at Google. You're not going to work at Meta or Twitter or Pinterest or any of these. Mm-hmm. And so listen to me and learn up and do your best to bring this to your organizations. And it's better than where you're at today. And even if that is true, I think it's really, really arrogant.
Okay, welcome to the Digible Dudes podcast. I'm David.
I'm Reid.
Reid, we're here for a gripe session. Gripe? Yeah. Not sour grapes and gripes about... You were just talking to me offline about some how some business book authors have really... I was trying to think. Adam
Made me throw up in my mouth.
Yeah.
I think I've used that before.
Just really grind your gears, basically, with their tonality, or with the tonality. And then we were trying to think of what the title would be to help direct us in this. And we're like, well, let's see what clickbait our producer comes up with. So
yeah.
We'll see
hopefully Darren can come up with something smart.
Yeah.
But yeah, it does feel like just, gripes about business book authors.
Yeah, it's
that genre.
So which we
consume in mass.
Yeah. Do you want to start with the one that set you off on the topic?
Yeah, sure. I must be a glutton for punishment. I think it was Stephen Covey's 7 Habits of Highly Successful People. Mm-hmm. And I may have, this is how much he gets to me. I may have inserted the word highly because I don't even know if that actually is in the title, if it's just the 7 habits of successful people or something.
Of the only successful people.
Of the only successful people. That's probably what he originally did, craft as a title, and then his editor said, no, that's a little bit strong.
Yeah, it is highly effective.
Highly effective there. I thought so. Yeah. So this has been building for me.
But you did love Speed of Trust.
Love's a strong word. I thought there's some, and that's in a way my gripe is like there's some valuable teachings in that he even in this book, but it's the way that he writes, the way that he talks about it, that just feels so arrogant to me, and. Yeah, I was going to say, has this been building in me for a while? And I'm sure I'm not the only one, which is part of why I'm comfortable, I guess, bringing it to our listeners or podcasts. But so many of these folks are, what's the right word? Zealot is probably not the right word. But they're just so convinced that their assessment, I guess, and maybe I need to almost back this up. Like, this is all understandable. I remember one of the, when I first started doing some writing, it was my sister, Kami, who's, published author a few times over and, 8,000 times better writer than me. But that was her career. And she knew I enjoyed writing, more just creatively. So like short stories and stuff like that. And I was in a kind of I don't know if it's a bad spot, but just in an intersection, I'll say, in my career. It was between, funny enough, Verizon, which you and I share that in our background, and pharma. And it seemed, I'm just going to try to shortcut this, that every time she and I had a conversation, she was like, you either need a therapist or you need to start writing. It's one of the two. Probably both would be good for you, but you clearly are frustrated right now with your career, the trajectory, the environment, the people. I was just, a ball of complaints. And so I was like, I don't have the money. And, at that time I was still a little anxious about going to therapy. And so I took the path of writing. And one of the most important pieces of advice she gave me before I started is she was like, it's almost like you and I with the podcast, but she's like, don't worry about who's reading it. Don't even think about that. Like, this is more for you than it is for anyone else. And that's one of the biggest mistakes that writers make, is they quickly start writing for other people. And that's when you lose your voice and ultimately often lose an audience. And she also said, your thoughts matter. Your opinion matters. so many people are intimidated or scared to write, not because they're incapable, but because they feel like they're going to be judged, and they get very insecure about that. It's like, what's more vulnerable than putting your thoughts down on a piece of paper or in a book, and you will be judged. And so how do you kind of cut through that or get through that? And she said, I'm just trying to give you the advice. That's the best I can do, but you're going to have to work this out for yourself. But just go for it, and know that your voice matters. And so I started Sales Smack. Nobody looked that up. There's no point, because I don't think that even today that you can dig that up anywhere on the internet. But I wrote this pseudonymous blog about the real world, the real sales world. You know all this. So I'm connecting it though.
Hold on, before we finish, do you think you were able to be that vulnerable or write the way you did for that because you were pseudonymous?
I found a balance of who I guess I was at my core, and then a character.
Right.
And I really enjoyed that. And that's the creative in me. Yeah. It's hard for me to resist that. So I had the fun of getting some of my real thoughts, like my, again, core self, or opinions, but embellishing or exaggerating right. some things. Yeah.
That's where I was getting. And I think that might apply to as you're going into these business book rant.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I think so. But I feel like if you're not going to kind of just exaggerate or embellish or allow yourself almost a new character, and you're just speaking for yourself, that there is a certain amount of humility. And I know this is a personal thing that you should exhibit in writing these books. But the conflict there is that if you perhaps do too much of that, then are you going to sell books? Are you really convincing people that you have the credentials, the background, the experience to be read? And I think that's what I'll say. Actually, just this most recent book. I mean, I am on this train right now. This 10x is easier than 2x, which is a book our producer recommended. This guy, Benjamin.
I know one Benjamin.
Yeah, I know.
Yahoo.
Okay.
Not the right.
I thought you were going to say Burns, our old friend from Bazzuto, like Harms or something. I think it's Harms. But anyways, he spends probably 30 pages on telling you his credentials and everybody he knows, and just his resume, and how what I was about to hear was gospel. It's like, take it to the bank, man. And that I almost couldn't get through it. I was so annoyed. And I was like, I did not need to hear all that. I already purchased the book. If this was like a preview, and if it was a preview, I wouldn't have purchased it. Like, I did not need that. And so that's what I'm getting at is there's, in a lot of these books, I feel like there's too much, I guess just pushing and, is it self-aggrandizing, kind of posturing and behavior where it's like, I am, almighty. Like, I know all this. And unfortunately, I think it does kind of cloud or tarnishes some of the value that they do provide in the books. And so I know I'm on this rant and I should give more specifics, but let me get back to, you said the book that, I kind of first started talking about that 7 Habits, is he implies that he knows what a successful person is or looks like. And he doesn't up front say, this is my definition. It may not be David's. It may not be Reid's. And that would have gone miles for me if I just heard him acknowledge, I have my own opinion, and you may not share that. And then the rest of the book, I'll never forget the qualifier. It's like, thank you for acknowledging that. But I would like a little bit more of that as he gets further into it. But instead, he does paint this picture of this is what a successful person is, and these are the habits, and none of it's scientific. There's not data, which I appreciate in particular about Adam Grant. Don't agree with everything that he writes or puts out there, but he tries. It's a big part of, I think who he's known for, or his identity, to incorporate evidence to support a lot of those theories. If you're trying to, rethink, unlearn, be successful, unlock your hidden potential, all that stuff that he writes about. And I also appreciate that about Simon Sinek. I think he does a good job with it. But some of these other authors,
Jim Collins.
yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Jim Collins writes with incredible humility. And then the book that I told you that, for me is still the standard, at least when it comes to business memoirs, book like entrepreneurial memoirs, I should say that. Entrepreneurial memoirs is Rand Fishkin. Because he writes, in such vulnerability, but you can feel the intelligence. You can feel like, you respect him. At least I did the further that I read the book. And also he actually knows how to write. I mean, that's another thing is he writes in a way that feels very conversational and versus just opining.
Sure. And the way it's been 7 years since I read his book, but it felt like at the time what I remember is that he wrote it in a way that was like, this was my experience and this is what I've learned from my experience versus this is the way you do it.
Exactly. You nailed it. And then I was just saying with Kim Scott, who is extremely, well respected and read, of course, with her book, Radical Candor, and almost all of them seem, they all turn it into consulting businesses, which she's done the same. But she worked in her 20s, which she very quickly points out, at Google, found herself working directly reporting into Sheryl Sandberg at Google, and then went over to Meta. I think she said, I was offered the job of CEO at Twitter, but I turned it down. But there's even points, there's a line in there where she says, I knew I could help this person, but the way that she put it was not just that simple. It was like, it really came off as, I'm smarter than them. I know that they're not going to solve this without me, and I may have even actually added that like as a clip on my audiobook because I was so irritated like that she had done that. So I'm speaking of self-awareness, I'm going to acknowledge that I have an allergy to this, it really gets to me. And so now, funny enough, in this book, 10X is easier than 2X. They talk about the mind will see what it wants to see. And that's also in psychology called selective attention or something. I mean, all this seems pretty obvious, but we will see, it, in particular the bias. I mean, it's the whole confirmation bias, but we'll see what the mind wants to learn or wants to recognize. And so for me, I think that's happening now. The further I've gotten in these books, I mean, I'm probably somewhere around 100, and the second, somebody starts opining and doesn't qualify or acknowledge, just as you said with Rand, that this was my experience or my perspective, I get hot, And so Kim, I feel like it's also the name dropping. It's the elite kind of nature of some of the, the content, or not the content, but the way that they present themselves or their experience. And so she's just constantly talking about the Silicon Valley companies and basically saying, we are smarter than everybody else. Yeah. We know how to figure everything out. And so that's why you're reading this book. Is because you're not going to work at Google, you're not going to work at Meta or Twitter or Pinterest or any of these. And so listen to me and learn up and do your best to bring this to your organizations. And it's better than where you're at today. And even if that is true, I think it's, really, really arrogant.
What's interesting is I think there is something to your point where, editors I've often heard, or whoever your publisher will say, like, no, take a strong stance. Because it's like...
right, exactly.
You want to get, like, you either want to be on the right side or the left side.
Neutral doesn't sell books.
Exactly. So it feels like you can almost get swept into it. What's interesting is...
That's like from Lost in Translation, the movie. I haven't thrown a movie quote in you forever. But when Bill Murray's getting he's doing the commercial, and... they're like yelling at Japanese in him and he can't understand. And he's like, I'm sorry, what? And he asked the translator, what is she saying? Or what is he saying? And she said, with more intensity.
Okay.
And he's like, okay, it sounded like there's a little bit more than that. Right. She's like, no. And then he says it. And then, he gets yelled at again. What was that again? more intensity. You know, it's like that's what these business book authors are getting. You know?
It does seem that way.
More conviction, more intensity, more polarizing.
Yeah, so the center line doesn't often work.
Yeah, look at politics.
So they say. I mean, there's some examples of like where the middle line can work, and I'll come up with one because I was just listening to something the other day on it. But now I'm curious though, what strikes you different from Reid Hastings with his? What was the book that we recently read of his?
No rules, rules.
Yeah. So why was that one different? Because there's name dropping and kind of like here's my.
There is, and I feel like it wouldn't come off much better, I'll say, or authentically if you have the CEO and founder of Netflix not talking about Netflix and being the founder and his network or circle to some degree. But I thought he did write that book with an incredible amount of humility. And one of the examples is as he was just talking about how lucky he was that Blockbuster shot him down. Like I think acknowledging some of the luck, that goes into that kind of success. I mean, even at our scale, we've had plenty of luck. I mean, we've had bad luck too. Jim Collins always talks about that, right? More successful people are opportunistic when they have the good luck, and then they find ways to mitigate the bad luck. Yeah, I feel like he also gave an enormous amount of credit. I mean, constantly calling out, acknowledging the people around him that helped build that company and helped him become maybe a little bit more cultured, level-headed. I mean, because that's a big part of it. He talks about cultural context and all that, and just some of the big blind spots that he had until he brought in, and what's her name? Is it Donna something? Who was his HR?
No, Patty McCord.
Patty McCord. I don't know where Donna came from. Good Lord. Yeah, Patty McCord and what she meant, for that company. And he talked himself about all the different times that he had kind of a self-doubt, and I think when you are willing to share, those moments, it goes a long way. But I feel like what I was telling you is if you listen to Radical Candor, you'll hear that several times. I mean, somebody might be like, well, Kim says that too. There's plenty of times. And that's where I would have to start sharing some paragraphs here or specific sentences. It's no different than you and I sitting across from each other and reading each other's like facial expressions or gestures. It's like, it's in these small like excerpts, verbiage where for me, somebody that again is so sensitive maybe to the written word, it's no different than me seeing a certain expression on your face. It's like, he's not really, either listening to me or he thinks what I'm saying is ridiculous. I mean, we talk about it all the time. Facial expressions, are almost better indicators than in fact, most people would say that better than what we're actually saying to each other. It's more meaningful, and so what I'm trying to say is many of these authors will try to pick some spots where they offer that humility or that acknowledgement. But there is for me, noticeable difference between certain authors when it comes to those exhibitions of humility.
Well, it's interesting. So before we get too far off Radical Candor, what I remember some of the criticisms of that book is that people often took that as almost and used it like a shield to be insensitive to others. Right. Where they would be like, "Oh, this is just Radical Candor. You're
Which
ugly."
she tells you is she actually opens the book. Thank you for saying that. Sorry, you just triggered this. But you and I both got a kick at least out of the first couple seasons of Silicon Valley. And did you know that book basically exploded as a result of it being on Silicon Valley?
No idea.
And so they talk about Radical Candor just the way you said. Yeah. And I can't remember, it was probably Ehrlich or
sounds like
who was like a total asshole. And it was like, I just read this book, Radical Candor. and so I thought it was funny, but then it was one example for me where she talked too much about being on that show and how I don't know. I mean, you have to listen to it, but it's like, I get it. Good for you. You're on the show. It made you successful, but you can you can just kind of leave it there.
Well,
But that was one of the downfalls of that. Yeah.
And it's sort of just to strengthening your point about like maybe that culture works at Google or that culture works at Facebook or whatever, Meta, but it may not work in your company. And when you act like you're saying, like if you write as if this is the way you should run a company with this radical candor, it doesn't. I mean, you and I have talked a lot about offshoring, and if you offshore, how those cultures don't even like to ask questions. And can you imagine going into that culture and being like, we abide by radical candor?
Right.
Like, I think that would be hard.
Right.
Wouldn't be well received. So yeah, I wanted to hit that point on radical candor, almost being like weaponized. It feels like at times to be like, I'm allowed to be an asshole because of this book. It's like, did you read the book? And also, I can understand how if you lean it heavy, it's similar to like essentialism, right? Where it's like if you lean far left or far right on any of these things, like totally one direction, it's probably taken out of what the author really means, but it's just how you internalize it. So the second thing, well, shoot, now it escaped me. I was going to hit 1 and 2. So your turn.
Well, the book I'm just starting, and I can already tell there's going to be some things that I'll carry with me that I'll probably pass on to some of our employees, or when I'm networking, talking to people that I think are really valuable and interesting. But as you always talk first principle, and I don't know if this is in fact, but I think it is kind of the first principle of the book, but is that if you think more in terms of 10x as a person, as an entrepreneur, as a professional, as a husband, as a son or whatever, like that, you are far more likely to achieve, I don't want to say meaningful because I think that's understating it, but transformative. That's it. Transformative. And he makes the distinction between transactional and transformative change. And he's like, most of us are going through life and pursuing, without even knowing it, transactional change, which is 2x in his opinion, where it's like you're really kind of doing a lot of the same things. You're just trying to do them better, more efficiently. And that is a slog all the way through life. Like if you approach it that way versus think so much bigger that you almost can't comprehend. It's like, so to 10x, and you and I have talked about this with our own company, but it's like, how would we 10x performance, let's just say, or 10x efficiency, or 10x the customer experience? What would that look like? And, he talks about, of course, you have to know what the baseline is and how to properly measure and all that stuff, versus like, how do we get to using the efficiency another 10 or 20 accounts? And if you take that path, it is going to take you much longer. It's going to be much more frustrating and far less likely to have transformative results. Whereas if you go for the 10x, you will literally have to think completely differently. And even if you don't, in fact, achieve 10x results, you're far more likely to have transformative outcomes. And in fact, it will be easier. And one of the main things he says is you'll be delegating a lot more. You'll have to bring in more people. You can't do what you're doing today if you're going to 10x anything. And so, but getting back to like one of the frustrations is it's like, well, now you got me leaning in. Like that's interesting. I want to hear more. But he basically implies like what a mediocre and almost, kind of worthless is too strong, but I just feel like it's very judgmental about the person, and especially knowing he's talking about the majorities that are 2xing it, as if that is a unfulfilled life, or if that's definitely a lesser than. And many of these books, because of your point earlier, which is so important to recognize, is that take a strong stance. Neutral doesn't work. That's not how you sell books. And therefore, strong stances typically are like overselling. They're like, or they're labeling. And it's like, this is what, again, success looks like. Or if you really want to have a transformative life, transformational life, or be transformational, then this is what you got to do. And this is happiness. This is greatness. It's like, I don't want to judge somebody if I actually feel like they're lazy, that's one thing. But if they don't have that level of ambition, don't make somebody feel bad about that. And I will give, funny enough, one of the authors that I'm kind of throwing some stones at, but I did appreciate that about Kim Scott. There's a point in the book where she talks about rock stars versus superstars, and she's like, I judged quite a bit. The rock star, meaning the person that was doing really good work but had no interest in getting promoted. They weren't pushing me necessarily even for more compensation. They just were happy in the chair that they were in. And I undervalued that. And you and I have talked about this. We won't name names, but and I just kept thinking I want high growth, which you and I has often talked about. We love the growth mindset. You've been so outspoken about that, and I think in a great way. I'm not saying that to be friendly here and make you but I don't think you've done that in like the judgmental way, and I think you've made sure people understand like that's who you are. But Kim Scott was like, that's what I thought we needed to build a team. Like, you can't build a team with people that are happy with where they're at. That's crazy. You have to build, like, you want people with big time motors, super smart, looking to grow. That's what I want on my team. And she's like, it nearly blew up in her face. I think she actually had an example of it did when she was maybe at Google. And when she talked to Sheryl Sandberg, she was like, you cannot have all super high growth superstars that are on these like crazy career trajectories. You need more balance with that. But I'm pointing that out, bringing that up. One, good for you. That was a good part of the book. But that, it's the whole judgment, that many of these books kind of, I think, inadvertently, or maybe it's not inadvertent, put out there early into the book.
Yeah.
That the reader feels it's like, oh, wow, if I'm not doing this, I'm a loser.
Yeah. That connects. It's almost like, when you first have only read a couple of these books, it can make you feel that way, like, oh, this person, Kim Scott, has it all figured out, versus
she's a genius.
There are other paths that maybe speak more to you. And it's like, I think about this with like different sales books or whatever. Like, there's different ways to sell, and some of those I just don't work for me, and some of those really do work for me. And so I think it's similar here, but that can, when you're just tiptoeing in, it can be hard to understand that it's like, Kim's isn't the only way to go. And that can also be a problem. Like, I know you and I have talked about, when do you just take something and run with it versus like take it and modify it first, right? This is one thing I do like about the Hermosis. You and I have talked about Layla and Alex. They're entrepreneurs, and he's published, I think, 3 books now. But his books are always like, this is what worked for me. Something else may work for you, but here's my system. And so I like that qualifier. And also, he refuses to write about something until he's done it. So until he's grown a business to 100 million, he doesn't want to write about it. And because then he feels like that to him is credibility. It's like, I've now done this thing. This is how I did it. It's not the only way, but if it's valuable to you, take it. But he often does say as well, he believes in sort of like surveying, the options, and then like learning them, and then picking one to be like, I'm going to go that direction. Now I'm going to try their system completely, how they do it. And then I can modify it, but I can't innovate until I imitate, is his view. Because he's like, if someone's like, you're going to 10x your results by doing it this way, and you immediately innovate on it, he's like, you didn't even know if you could imitate. Like, what if they forgot a part of the recipe, and you couldn't even imitate their 10x results? So, like, imitate it first, get the 10x results, and then innovate. And I also agree with you on, I agree with the premise on the 10x is easier than 2x, simply because I think many people, they're like, okay, that's the best I could do if they think 2x. And so then they sort of like shortchange themselves, and they're like, oh, so I'll be happy with 20%, right? Versus like 20% of 10x is 2x, right? So it sort of forces you to like get like in that mode of, but I also understand it would not make sense to me to have every team at a company shooting for the 10x. Right. It seemed like I think you need some of that stability, and it's almost like the bullets and cannons people or something need to be the ones thinking the 10x, because otherwise you could have, it's just what you said about where I would think it would be slightly different as far as those high growth mindset people would be if that was the founding team. Sure, the founding team is high growth mindset. That's going to work out, but that some people may grow at different rates. It's fine. But if you're going to build like 5 people in a 10,000 people organization, I do think that's going to be pretty rocky. So anyways, there you go.
Yeah. Well, I suppose what this may boil down to is that all of us, whether we realize it or not, and this is my theory, I'll have my own caveat. You may not agree with this at all, but have some sort of caveat, gradient, or spectrum, or I say caveat or qualifier because I'm now thinking of Aaron, our CPTO, but I labeled him Captain Caveat in his first 30 days at Digible because he wouldn't opine about anything, it seemed to me, without a caveat. Yeah. And at first I appreciated it, but the reason I gave him the label is because it was actually starting to get to me. I was like, you don't need to caveat everything. Yeah. It actually discredits sometimes. It makes me, not as interested or not as convinced. It's the whole power of persuasion, right? You lose some of your persuasiveness if you over caveat. And so that spectrum looks different for you than it does for me. And right now I'm hypersensitive to it. And so back to like what my mind is actually looking for and then seeing is probably these authors getting up on their high horse and acting like, they have it all figured out and their way is the only way. But for some people, they may not need hardly any caveats or acknowledgement. It's like they want the super strong opinion. They want to hear about all the name dropping, the incredible, C-suite like network that, some of these folks have and just get swept up in it. Yeah. But the further you go, I think it's harder to imagine that eventually that this kind of maybe stretch that I'm in doesn't start to hit people where it's like, I've read enough of these now that, that they're more aware of that tone.
I think it also depends who you're writing for, right? Like if you want to sell a bunch of books, as you said, you might take the Radical Candor approach versus like how many folks are writing for the real deep cut of someone that's read 100 of these books. It's like that's not a huge audience. Also, one thing I think to me that's important is that it's not to get out there is that what would be a shame is if some people took away from this conversation that you have to go the Daniel Pink or Jim Collins like crazy amount of research to write a book. It's more of what you're saying is almost like the if I think back to Covey, he was writing books in like the 80s, and so like things have changed over 40 years, right? As far as like what maybe what makes a compelling book, and at least to your
the formula's changed,
right? Yeah, it's like if we were reading Rockefeller's stuff, like even the language is different, right? So it's like that changes over the decades, and that's okay.
The zeitgeist, business books.
Then, so a couple things, like you can well research it. Then there's also a half-life on the research because Malcolm Gladwell has been criticized for some of his books because of some of the studies that came out after his books, and it's like, well,
discredited his.
Yeah, it's like I still like Outliers. I still think there's some value there, right? And then Daniel Pink will face the same thing. If you write about your experience, it can in some ways last longer because it's like, well, that was my experience, right? It's like Ben Horowitz, Hard Thing About Hard Things. It's like that was a pretty even book, acknowledged a lot of the luck through the process and bad luck, and was seemed to be his authentic experience about how he got there. And that one has lasted, I don't know, it feels like 15 years or something at this point. So anyways, I just think like what I wouldn't want people to think is that they have to, it's like, I think I have a book in me and I think I have something valuable to say. To your sister's point, like their opinion is valid. However, I need all this research and that's too much. I can't do it. Right. Versus, no, there's just different ways to target it. And it can, so I guess it's like write a book you're proud of and who cares what anybody says about it.
Right. Totally. Those assholes like me that are complaining about your tone. I think the context, again, you could overdo context, Captain Context, or variables, but, one of the things, funny enough, it was Culture Map that was a referral many people have read now from Reid Hastings in No Rules, but it wasn't. This is one of those funny names. It's like the guy from Jim Collins, the Admiral that I always Stockdale.
Yeah,
I got
Stockdale
it. Holy
Paradox.
cow!
Yeah,
but now I'm losing Barbara McCord. Patty McCord.
She didn't write Culture Map, did
That's what I was about to say. She did not write that.
Yeah, it's Aaron Meyer.
Aaron Meyer, yes. a little dry for me. Like, think that book could have been probably 25% as long as it was. She kept making, for me, a lot of the same points, examples, but I loved the call out on contextual versus linear thinking. And where I'm going with this and trying to connect it, tell me if this is too big of a stretch, to this thread about business books, is it's similar to maybe like the, well, no, I don't think it is. I was going to say the neutrality versus like more polarizing. But she says in the Western hemisphere that we think much more linear. And she actually traces that back to like the founding of the United States of America. Like, she gets really into the history and culture, and like what versus Eastern hemisphere with like Confucius and give me another Eastern philosopher.
Oh, well, if you just said philosopher, it's like maybe I could get there with you. Like, we got like Copernicus or like
yeah, Copernicus. Okay. That's good.
But when you put Eastern on it, I'm like,
that's crazy. That was narrowing down too much. It's to half the world.
Yeah.
But she said they're all about context, and so whether it's social classes or whether it's an economic infrastructure, like. All the way back then, but everything was connected, interconnected. And so they just, generation after generation, were programmed to think contextually. And then for us, I'm not going to try and give the history lesson here, but we were way more about one thing. We wanted freedom. So I will say this from Britain. And so that's how we started. And then as we built up business, it was like, very entrepreneurial and, this is my business, very linear, right? I don't know. I'm going to not go any further with that. But the basics and the essence of it is that contextual thinkers are looking at just that, all sorts of things, variables around them to form opinion. Whereas linear thinking is like, this is point A to point B. This is how you get there. This is how you do it. And I feel like many of these books, this is my effort to connect, present in more of a linear fashion. And is it a surprise because many of the folks that I'm reading or we're reading are Western Hemisphere? Yeah. Not bad. So I'm wondering if I read some books by Eastern Hemisphere entrepreneurs, if I would actually enjoy those or connect with those more, because I feel like they're doing a better job of acknowledging all the variables and context that, goes into running a business, being a leader, being a successful entrepreneur.
Yeah, it's super interesting. I have one other thing that came to mind. Nicole's business coach / therapist is releasing a new book, and it's an entrepreneurship book, and she sent Nicole an early copy that both of us read and gave notes on. And my criticism of that early book was both her and her husband are very prominent founders. And my criticism was that she went out and interviewed 20 other founders and included all their stuff in this book. And I was like, Sherry, why didn't you put more of your experience in this book? Because and so it's almost a little bit the opposite of where you were going, because she was like, well, my editor or whoever, somebody in the publishing realm, was like, people don't want to hear about you. They don't want to hear you bragging or whatever. And I was like, honestly, I don't know any of these other 20 founders. I know you, and I trust you. And so I want to hear your experience. And the fact that you basically removed it from the book leaves me kind of, it felt empty or hungry. I was like, I don't know these other 20. And maybe part of it is that the sample size was 20, and how many founders would I need her to do a Jim Collins, here's a subsection of 200 people or something. But it was just interesting because her feedback back to me was like, that's originally how I and Rob wanted to do it. But then our publishing people were like, hey, that we recommend this way. And I was like, well, I think they're wrong. But also I listen to her and Rob. They both have their own podcasts. I listen to those every week for years. And so there's a certain amount of I guess in some sense, if they had written the book, it's maybe I'd already have heard all the stories, but to have it condensed into one book, I think would have been helpful. And I was craving that versus these other randos I don't know. So just interesting. So I guess what that leads me to is, do you have a quick way to say like how you would want to do it? Like, how do you build credibility while also not overdoing, whether it's the name dropping or the success metrics or whatever, because you want someone that maybe doesn't even know Reid to have faith in the book and give it some credence, right? Well, also not almost like you're in love with yourself kind of judgment.
Right. Yeah, great question. I think similar to, and it has been just as long for me on Rand. We read it about the same time. But I think you just shortcut the credibility with the appropriate acknowledgments, is that there was some luck that went into, we'll say, Digible having the success that it's had, but we were able to build a company from scratch, bootstrapped, and get it to this size, and build this kind of reputation, etc. I'm not going to keep filling that out, but so that's my credibility. And I'm going to, again, acknowledge that a lot of things had to go our way in order for us to get that far. And then I do believe, and this is talk about kind of the modern book, like, or formula recipe for, is it's impossible to overlook the social network influence, we'll say, whether that's LinkedIn or whether it's just happening on podcasts. But if you bring in more people, like this editor was advising your friends, then you have automatically built in more audience, or at least better shot. It's like, well, if I drop these 20 names, they're going to be mentioning it to their network, and they'll mention it to their network. And it's just a very, not Ponzi scheme, but it's a easy way to get, kind of out of the blocks fast. Mm-hmm. And then if people actually like the content, it could really travel. And so I get that. And I think there's a certain amount of that for me. If I were writing a book, which maybe one day I will, it's certainly an option. I would not just write it, from my POV, I guess, with my opinions only. At minimum, we've talked about collaborating, but I think that'd be a lot of fun, is to bring in a lot of your perspective, point, counterpoint type. I think people appreciate that. But then I would love to have some of the other people that have been on this podcast. If I were writing a book about multifamily marketing or entrepreneurship in the real estate realm or something like that, I would definitely include some other folks, but it would not be their book. It'd be more like, these were relationships we made along the way, and they had some really interesting opinions, and sometimes validating what we many of us want validated, but lots of contrarian perspective too.
It's interesting. I'm just in the middle of a book called Storyworthy. Mm-hmm. Have you heard of this one? It's been on my list for years, and I wasn't. I had figured, I'll need this whenever I'm going to launch a new company or whatever, because I was sort of taking it at face value, like, this is how to do better stories. And when you start a company, you usually tell it. And I was like, for now, I wasn't thinking that there's any big story I need to tell. But funny enough, I was talking with Alex Toppler, and he was like, hey man, you should be reading this. You should be reading Storyworthy. I was like, what? Don't I need that before I go into, like, I need to tell a big story? He's like, no. It's about basically, it goes well with a lot of the stuff I'm doing now, like journaling and self-work and whatnot, but it goes into the humor habit. I think it and the humor habit connect really well. But it's just like, how do you tell a story every day? So like he encourages you every day to write down, what is my story of the day? And this has lots of benefits to, like, helping you remember more, helping time feel like it's going more slowly, because the days don't just, like, sort of evaporate. You can look back at your shorthand of, like, on the 14th, this was my story. And so you don't even write the whole thing out. You just write, like, sort of like triggers to remind you of it. How was I getting there? Storyworthy. But what he was saying is that when the Moth is a big storytelling competition that happens in New York City. I'd been when I lived there, but you basically weekly, they draw names out of a hat and you have to tell a story based on a theme. And then every quarter they do a grand slam where it's like, who's gonna beat all the other prior Friday champions, basically. And he's won like 27 of the 45 story competitions he's entered, and has grand slammed like 4 times. So pretty good credentials. But he says when you're telling a story, you will often have a story that is really is someone else's story. But you can't tell someone else's story because it doesn't bring the reader in. It doesn't give you, it's because it's not your story to tell. So instead he's like, he gives you tools about how do you integrate this was Reid's experience, but here was my view of his story is kind of how it went. So I just thought it was interesting, and I think that's almost like it just applies to what you're saying about like you bring these other folks in, but he would encourage, like, you don't then tell whatever Robert Turnbull, you don't like just tell his story for him. You tell your view of his story, which then helps you, just have more authenticity, I guess, and more credibility through the process.
Yep. Makes sense. Well, is there anything else as far as, I mean, I'm sure we have more gripes on these authors, but I'm focusing on the arrogance versus the humility. Anything else that...
My last thing is just, you briefly touched on it, but most of the time I feel like these books could be 60 pages and not 300 pages. And I've done some looking into that, and there's something like you want it 300 pages, so then when it's on the bookshelf, you actually have a spine that someone can read, like the title of. And I'm like, this is
versus a pamphlet.
Right. And I'm like, this is kind of a dumb reason. Because also, how many books are being sold in hard, like, versus digital these days anyways, or audiobooks? And when I see an audiobook that someone recommends me that's like 3 hours, I'm like, kick ass, buy now. Like, I don't, even if I'm not planning to read it right now, I'm like, buy now, because it's 3 hours. So yeah, that's my gripe.
Well, funny you mentioned that, because right before we popped on, we were talking about different books, that we've read since we last did, we'll say, some sort of review on these podcasts. You asked me about Death by Meeting, which I mentioned, and this was one of those books which doesn't happen often, not because they aren't willing to read or enjoy reading, but we don't always line up, meaning the executive team. But when I brought up Death by Meeting, which my former executive coach, Devick, recommended to me, everybody read it. And I mean, everybody.
The title? The title got people?
Well, yeah, the title got people, but I think it's also Lencioni's, formula, which is parables. And you just said it. If the audiobook's 3 hours, you're all over it. And I think this one's like 3.5 hours. So many of his books are short, and he has his own formula, but I do appreciate that about his books, is I don't feel that arrogance. And part of it's because he's telling these, fictional stories. And so you end up hating some of the characters, and you probably identify with a few, or you kind of support some of the others. I mean, it's really smart. It's no different than a movie. And he, in fact, in the book talks about how meetings should be viewed way more like movies, and that they're very comparable, which is probably part of why it landed with me, is I got a kick out of that. But he's like, what makes a great movie?
Confrontation, yeah.
Conflict.
Gino Wickman says the same thing about meetings.
Yeah. Well, and sometimes that's the other thing we didn't get at, but it does get me. So not to extend the podcast, but that is another gripe, is it's like, how many of these have the same principles or the same kind of theories? And in some cases I hear the attribution where it's like, this is really Jim Collins, or this is Covey's. But I just figured, since you mentioned it, and I do think a lot of these could be smaller, that's something more of these authors might want to experiment with, because I don't know too many others, unless you've come across them, that take the parable it's a 3-hour audio book. It feels like he owns that.
Does feel like he owns
Lencioni.
that. I don't know others.
And it's smart. Obviously, he's very well known, sells extremely well.
Cool. Well, got your gripes out?
For now, yeah.
Yeah, we'll see how you feel about that.
I got an 8 of them.
Another one.
Yeah.
All right, we'll see you guys next time.
All right.